If you're ready to go, why don't you take it away?
Great. Thanks very much. Thanks, Kim. So thanks, everyone. I appreciate you taking the time to be here with us. This slide is not a picture of me. I didn't realize it looked so much like the person was presenting that was on that slide. So maybe I'll change that next time. Anyway, right before the holidays, really glad to have you take the opportunity to be with us and talk about workflows. As Kim mentioned, there's a lot of good information in the workflows that are available to you. They've been out for a couple of different versions. We will talk about what's been out over each of those versions. We're going to talk about what's available in terms of workflows. Our agenda will include workflow setup. Then we'll look at transaction routing and the workflow logic, the web client, web services, and the email setup. We're going to cover quite a bit today. So we're going to start out with our available workflows. What is available to you in the workflows? Now these workflows are not SharePoint dependent. In the past, GP had functionality that was requiring that SharePoint be included in that process. That is no longer the case. So this list that we're presenting at the moment then is all of the options that you have for workflow processing that's not SharePoint dependent. So we're going to start out with our purchasing module. The first one here is payables batch approval. So if you have, if you're doing your accounts payable in batches and you want someone to be able to review that batch edit list and approve it so that those are all coded to the right accounts and whatnot, you could certainly use that batch approval process to have them reviewed and processed through. You can do a payables transaction approval. You probably wouldn't want to do both of those, not transactions and batches. You can turn off the ability to post individual transactions so that all of them go to a batch. That would help assure that you got all of your batches approved and all of the transactions in those batches approved. Purchase order approval, right? So if you're using purchase orders, this will approve those purchase orders. Purchase requisition approval, again, it's typical that the requisitions would be approved or the purchase orders, but not typically both, because a requisition is typically turned into a purchase order. However, it is possible to do both if you choose. And then vendor approvals. So if you put your vendors through an approval process, for instance, if you need to make sure that you get the documentation for 1099 ability from your vendors, you can put those vendors through an approval process and validate that all of the details are in your possession before you start doing business with a vendor. That's one of the ways that we see the vendor approval process being used. In the financial series, we have the ability to do a general ledger batch approval as well. So all of those general journal entries could go saved into a batch, the entire batch be approved before you process it out to a posting status, and then you don't have so many reasons to perhaps do reversals or changes in your approval process. In the sales, we have receivables batch approvals. In project accounting, we have two of them there, the expense report approvals and timesheet approvals. In the payroll, we have a number of workflows that are available under payroll. We have employee profiles, employee skills, employee direct deposit approvals, time card approvals, and employee W-4 approvals. So all of those different things could go through a workflow process before they get transacted. Okay, so that was our list of all the available workflows. So we've got quite a number of them. I will say also that as of GP 2016, we have one additional one that I'll be showing you when we get into the actual GP application that allows you to be able to approve a SQL view prior to having it be a part of your SmartList Designer. Okay. All right, so let's jump over to our GP application and actually look at the process. Okay, so here I am. I'm in my GP 2016 on my home page here. So mine's got lots of different boxes on it, including time management and procurement. Those are available to you that have some specific details that relate to the payroll and human resources in the time management box. And in procurement, I have the purchase requisitions as a part of my home page there. I also want to point out while we're on my home page that there is, within the to-do pane, the functionality of being able to add my workflow tasks right to my home page. So there's things that I need to take action on right there on my home page where I can see them and know what I need to take action on. And we're going to talk about some of the other places that we can have those workflow tasks show up as well. Okay. So first of all, I'm going to navigate to my administration area page. And in my administration setup window, so you may not have access to all the things that I'm showing today depending on your security settings. So if you don't see them, don't assume that you don't have that functionality. It may just be that you don't have security to them. So I have full access to everything that I'm demonstrating for you today. So at the top part, we're going to look at administration setup. In the system section, I'm going to scroll down, and there is a workflow setup that's at the system level. So remember, this level is across all your companies. So we have at this top level an indication of whether I want to enable the email for workflows. And if you're going to do that, you have some details that you're going to need to get probably from your IT department to get the email address, the display name, and the server name and port that are a part of your ability to be able to email from your GP application. Then there's an SMTP authentication, again, stuff that you'll get from your IT department. And then the bottom part has an enable email actions. So we're going to look in a little bit at what an email action looks like. When you get an email that has an indication that you need to take action on a workflow, this would be the ability to be able to take action on those emails and be able to make those happen. So in order to do that, we'll talk later again, there's a slide later about this web services and the information that's necessary to do that. So this setup would allow us to do that, and then we would be able to test that email and test those email actions right here on this setup window. So once we have that system level setup accomplished, then I'm going to go down a little farther in my setup window to the part about the company. So within the company then I'm going to set up the specifics about my workflows, and of course then this can be on a company by company basis. So if I want it set up in one company and not in another, I can do this part in each company. So I have my little caret here that's next to workflow that opens up this section of my workflow area page where I'm first going to choose my workflow calendar. The workflow calendar gives me the ability to be able to create an indication of days that may not be a part of my, my typical business hours within my company. So right now my company's hours are set up for Monday through Friday from 8 to 5, but July 4th during 2017 is a typical day off in my organization. So by creating this calendar and indicating what holidays or days that I'm closed in my calendar, we're going to see in just a minute how I can apply a amount of time for someone to take action on a workflow, and any of these days that I've indicated as holidays or closed days then would not penalize the person who's been given a task within a time frame to have to be out of the system or have approved those things within that period of time based on this calendar. So again, you might want to put all of your company holidays. You'll notice on 2016 I had a few more, including Sandy's day off on 8/1. So you can set these up with any holidays or any close dates that you have in your calendar. The next part of our systems, or our company setup for workflow I'm going to look at is the email message setup. So I don't have the ability on my image here to actually do the email process. So the messages that I just closed were about the fact that I don't have email available on this image, but I can still open up the message setup to show you. Based on this, there's a number of workflow actions that come out of the box from GP that are things that you can include in the message that gets sent to someone based on workflow activities. So the ones that are preceded by the WF mean that they're workflows, and then the rest of the ID is what tells us what kinds of things it is. So if we ignore the first one, which was a custom one I created, then the rest of these are when a workflow action is completed, do you want it to have an indication of that to someone? And then down through the rest of these, that includes all of the different assignments, including some employee ones, and even workflow approval for W-4s and so forth. So each of these, I'm going to stick with something like maybe a PO approval, and I'll bring that up into the window so I can give you a little more details about what this email message setup does. So I can see that it's a workflow assignment, it's on the purchasing series, and it's for the purpose of purchase order approvals. Within the body of my message, I can tell someone that you have been assigned a task for, and then anything that I see within this brackets means that it's going to fill in that space with information that comes directly from the workflow activity. So it's going to be a message like something that looks like you have been assigned a task for the step name 123 step in the purchase order approval workflow for purchase order, and then it'll give them the purchase order number. It's going to tell them the task has a deadline, and to edit or view the document, they can even drill right back into GP to see that information. I have a workflow action list, and then I can even put the rest of the information like the PO number, the vendor, the document date, all of those things based on the specific purchase order that they're going to be approving for. And I can even set so that the document line details come into that workflow approval so that all the information can be right there on the email message, so they don't have to open up GP to get the rest of the review process completed if they don't need to do that. Okay? So great out-of-the-box functionality. Then you can take these and copy them. Notice there's a copy button here that I could use and be able to create new ones that are specific with the details that I need to have on it that might be different than what Microsoft provided to me out of the box. Down here at the bottom of the window, I also can have those replies when a email message goes out to an approver. I can have all of those replies sent to a particular email address so that when they click reply as opposed to taking action on those workflows, that the replies would go to a specific mailbox. So very often when it comes to things like PO approvals, we might have those sent back to a mailbox like purchasing@interdynbmi.com. That way it would be to a group email or to a person-specific account that would be all of the people that relate to purchasing. You also can put multiple names into that reply sent to if you want to have the replies sent to multiple individual users. Okay? So that's our message setup. The next part of our demonstration then is actually to create the workflow maintenance. So my next place to navigate to is workflow maintenance. The window automatically opens to purchasing, and I think that's probably because that's where a majority of the workflows are taking place. But notice that when I click the down arrow, there are all of the other modules that we talked about. So if I look at financial, I'll see my general ledger batch approvals. If I go to sales, I would see receivables, and so forth down the list. So it does start with purchasing, but the other modules are available there for you to choose from. So one of the things, if you've been using GP for very long, that you would probably recognize is that when fields are grayed out, you likely can't make any choices in those boxes. So when I look at this manager's box here, I might assume that because it's all gray that I can't make any choices in this window. But that actually is not the case. The very first step for creating a workflow is to make sure that you have a manager assigned to the workflow maintenance window. And workflows are driven based on Active Directory users, not on GP users. So the manager for a workflow is the person that it would be escalated to, or could go in and make changes to this particular workflow if something went wrong with it, if a workflow got stuck somewhere, or if you needed to go make changes to it because of changes in your organization. So there needs to be a manager assigned. In order to do that manager assignment, I click on the looking glass over here, and then I have to find based on my Active Directory. Again, I want to point out, I want to draw your attention right down here. I'm actually logged into my GP as the SA user. That's my username. But if I went to find in my find and typed in SA and clicked on either the tab key or in the binoculars, I would not find a user called SA. Right? I find a user called myself, but not a user called SA. So you're looking at the Active Directory users. So I'm going to type in GP admin because that's actually the one that I want to have be the manager for this. So if I start typing and click the tab key, it would find my GP admin user. I also can click on the binoculars, which is an advanced find, and be able to look up additional ones, but you have to at least know something about the way your Active Directory users are named in order to be able to find them. Right? So you might have to work with your IT people to know what the Active Directory list is. Once I find the one that I'm looking for, then I click on the Add button. It moves it from the Find section to the Selected Users, and then click OK. So that gray area now has a manager that is the manager for the Payables Batch Approval workflows. Then I'm going to click Save Type, and that manager would now be approved. If I left that particular workflow and came back to it, I would now see that that manager has been assigned to my Payables Batch Approvals. So we're going to stay with our Payables Batch Approval for the ones that we're going to create a workflow for today. So we're going to create a new workflow for Payable Batch Approvals. Okay. So the next step is to click on the New Workflow button. So I'm going to create a new workflow. On the left-hand side here, I have a tree where it's keeping me informed about where I'm at in my process. And this caution sign is telling me that it's open. I don't have all of the details in here that are necessary to have this workflow be in place. Then on the right-hand side, I get the fields where I'm actually going to fill in the details that I need to take action on. So this workflow name, I'm going to name this All Batches, because I want all of my payables batches to go through a workflow. I'll show you in a few minutes how we can put some filter criteria on that, but ultimately I want all my batches to go through the process. Okay, click the tab. The description, I'll leave that all batches as well. There is more characters in description if you need to give it a little more information. The Active button is only available for a single workflow under each workflow type. So I can only have one Payables Batch Approval workflows active at any time. We're going to leave that Active button until after we get our workflow all set up, and then we'll mark it at the end. Then the options give me the ability to send notifications for completed actions. So we looked earlier at the messaging we could send. So we can send that message back to the originator if we want. We can allow the approvers to delegate tasks. So you actually have the ability, very similar to your out of office, if you're not going to be available to take action on your workflows, to delegate those tasks to other users while you're out of the office. So we're going to mark that. In most cases, you don't want to allow the originator to be an approver, but in my case, because I'm in a demo environment, I need to be the originator and the approver, so I'll mark it for me, but you would typically not include that. Always require at least one approver. So, based on your filters, there's sometimes times when you could actually keep it from having need to be approved by anyone. So in your case, you could choose to always require at least one approver, and then you could even use an alternate approver for that final approver if you needed to do that. So you can do those things separate or together. When a task is overdue, what do you want to have happen? So again, we're going to be applying an amount of time for someone to take action, in which case, if it's overdue, what do I want to have happen? So I can escalate it to the next approver, I can escalate it to a particular person, or I can automatically reject it back to the person who sent the batch in the first place. So I'm going to escalate mine to, and I'll choose myself this time. This time I want to make note that the selection type actually has the drop-down arrow and gives me some options up here. We're going to talk a little bit about selection types, but in a different webinar we would talk about more of the details there about selection type. So I'm going to this time choose myself as the person that I would escalate to, and then click the Add button and click OK. So now when a task is overdue, I'm going to escalate it to myself for my approvals. So once I've finished all the details on this particular window, I'm going to save the workflow, and that clears my caution sign and says, indeed, I have enough information to be able to have a new workflow that is called all batches now. The next part of my process is to create a new step. So I've got my batch headers, now I'm going to create the steps within that. So when I click on New Step, it gives me that same indication in my tree that I don't have everything in place yet to save it. My step I'm going to call All Batches. You can have multiple steps, and you can call them different things. And I'll show you an example of what those options are in another workflow I already have set up. The step type can be either an approval or a task. All the approvals are the ones that you would actually have be part of the process to make approval actions within emails. Okay. I can set this as the action is always required, or I can set this based on a filtered list and only when particular conditions are met. So for our demo, I want to show you how I'll set action is required only when particular conditions are met. So once I click on that, my field becomes available here. I can then click on the expansion button, and I get a window that I get to tell it what the conditions are that I want it to meet. So in this case, I can say where and select a field. It gives me a bunch of different options for all the different kinds of things that I could choose. So I could say where a batch ID is certain things, where the frequency, last date, the batch actual total, right? The transaction transaction controls. So very often in the case of of batch approvals, you might say a batch total actual, and then you get to choose your filter. So contains, doesn't contain, is not, even is empty. So a bunch of choices there, good choices. So I might say my batch actual total is greater than and includes $1 or $100, let's say. So that means that the total of the transactions within the batch needs to be $100 or more in order for this to need to be approved. Then I can click the Add button, that puts it down in the list, and I could go on and say and or other choices in my filters list. So for this one, I want to say there's also a box here for display extended field list, When I click that before I choose my field, you'll notice that I now have a longer list to choose from at the top. So there's additional extended fields that we can even add beyond what's available in the first list by clicking this box, and then I can choose additional details. So if I were to say my batch date is on or after 01/01/17, then only my batches that have $100 and are after January 1st would require any workflow to take place on them. Okay. I can also, lastly, compare one field to another field. So if I wanted to see the line date compared to the batch header date, I could see those as field value comparisons because they're like kinds of fields, date versus date. I can click OK, and now those filters are applied to this. In the next step, if the condition is not met, then what happens on this particular step condition? So I'm going to continue to the next step when this step is not completed, and then I can assign that to an approver. So who would I want to have approve this when those conditions are met? So I have another user in my system named Brian Wilton, and I'll add him. So now this step is assigned to Brian Wilton, and he has 8 hours to complete this. Now you can key in any number, and you can choose between hours, days, and weeks. And then I've got an indication here to apply that workflow calendar that we looked at a few minutes ago. I'm going to tell it to send a message, and then I'm choosing which of those messages that we set up in our first steps that I want to go out. Then I can also include document attachments and even Word templates. So for the batch approvals, the Word templates are what gives us the ability to be able to send those batch edit lists as an attachment to an email. So because we're doing batches, we would want to include those Word templates, and I can include those document attachments if I like. The completion policy, only one response or a majority or all must approve. Then I'm going to save my step, and I have a new all batches. I do have some filters on these just for demonstration purposes, but we have a new workflow that I could now go back to the all batches and click the active button to turn that on and save my workflow. It's now my active one, which gives me a green check mark to show that this is the one that's active. So for the sake of time, we won't go through too many complex choices, but I do want to drop down here and just show you a couple of the other alternatives that you have with regard to some of the setups in these. So if I'm doing an all requisitions approvals, I might have just a single step, but I could also look at things like having sequential and sequential steps by dollars. So I'm going to show you a little bit more about these, the way that I've set the sequential ones. In this particular workflow, I have it set up that if the step is $500 or more for my purchase order, then my assignment is to go to Sandy. If my purchase order is $750, it's to go to Brian. If it's $1,000, it goes to the GP admin user. Whereas this one, if it's 500, if it's 500, it always goes to Sandy. If it's 750, it goes to Sandy first and then to Brian. And if it's 1,000, it goes to Sandy first, then to Brian, and then to the GP admin. So you can see how you can use different sorts of sequential steps to be able to have it go to a single person or even to multiple people based on how you set up those steps. In the way that the sequential steps are set up, the way that we have these show up in this tree in this format is when I created the 750 step, I set that order to be following step number 500. And in this case, the 1000 step is set to follow the 750 step. If I look at that same setup up here, this is always a first step on each one of these. So some really great options for you in terms of how you set up the possibilities for all the different ways that you send those out for approvals. Okay. So we have accomplished creating an all batches payables batch approval process. Let's go back to our slide deck here. And we're going to talk in terms of the actual slide deck about some of that transaction routing that's available, similar to what we just looked at in the demo. So some of the logic tips that are available is an OR statement is exclusive. So it's not able to be inclusive of other statements. So it's some things for you to remember while you're looking at these, and some logic that you might want to employ is available to you here in this webinar and on this slide deck, so you can have it to go back and reference if you needed to look at one of these later on. So best practice for a scenario would be to have 3 conditions in one step, similar to what we have showing there. Some additional tips. You cannot set hard-coded approval limits like you could with Business Portal. So in the old days, you could have a person that had just a dollar amount approval limits, but that's not available like that in these workflows. You instead have to route the workflow based on the amounts on the document. The setup of the workflow can vary based on whether or not you want sequential or skip level approvals. So that was one of the things that I mentioned in the hierarchy. You can do skip level approvals. So the question to ask yourself is, should the document go directly to the level approval or have it be approved by each approver in the chain? Okay. So I'm going to go back and we're going to look a little bit about the 2 options that you had available to you then in those approval lists. Okay. So within the assignment for the batch, this all batches, when I clicked on the looking glass for the assignment 2, we have people and groups, which is always going to give me the opportunity to choose from a person. I have the hierarchy, right? When I choose hierarchy, I get to start from things like a workflow originator. I could go to the workflow manager. Remember, we did manager at the beginning we assigned a manager at the beginning of our workflow, or I could even choose an alternate final approver. So if I use hierarchy, these are my start froms, and then I can choose direct manager, the skip level manager, and even the number of levels that I wanted to skip. Then I also have workflow roles that I could choose, so those 3 roles become available as well for the workflow manager and the alternate final approver. So those other choices give me some additional functionality that I could choose from in my selection type, and even be able to skip levels up to higher levels. And then the sequential, I mentioned, are the options that we have here in these 2 choices. Okay, so web client, web services, and email setup. So the web client has become available in the last few versions as of 2015. We have this new web client that's available. It actually has become much more functional, much greater functionality, greater broad range of functionality within the 2016 version. And then we're also going to talk about web services and what the requirements are in terms of the email setup that's necessary. The SMTP server settings, so we looked at the window for that when we first went to our demo environment. Those settings are server specific, and they must be provided by the Exchange admin for your environment. So I mentioned the IT people might help Exchange admins if you have a separate group that does Exchange admins. The common email provider SMTP settings can usually be found online, so if you use Office 365, I've given you the information there for the SMTP information that you'd need in that setup window, And if you use Hotmail, that's the port and everything that's necessary for that as well. Use the test email button to verify that the settings are correct. So the buttons that I pointed out at the top of the window are ones that you'll definitely want to use. They will indicate whether or not that setup is going to work for you before you get to the point of doing your testing. Web services is a functionality that comes on the media from your GP media to set up web services. It does have a wizard, but there are some things that within that web services setup that might require you to either engage your IT folks, or you might need to contact InterDyn and let us help you with that web services install, because it's a necessity to allow the workflow approvals rejections without needing to open GP. So if you want to use the email functionality, web services is a requirement. And then in that email actions area, where the public DNS address that resolves back to your web services server, this is the approve and reject links that are generated with the public DNS record. So only check the HTTPS link if web services has been configured with that secured link. Otherwise, you can just use the HTTP. Okay, so the email message IDs look like, the email message itself look like the bottom part of my slide here. So we talked about what the message language is, and you can see here from the first part of this slide that you've been assigned a task for the new workflow step. In this case, it was called STEP, in the purchase requisition approval workflow for purchase requisition and the number. The task deadline tells them when they have to take action on it, and then edit or review the document. If they have GP open on their desktop, they can click that blue hyperlink for the requisition, and it'll open that back to GP where they can see those details. And then in this slide, I have approve and reject as my other two blue hyperlinks, but you can also include delegate. Right? So if you want them to be able to delegate this to someone else, you can do that. There's the information about which company it is, which document, who it was requested by, when, the document amount, and the comments. So each time that a workflow is submitted, the person who is submitting it can put comments on it. So if you need to place an order for a new server, you can certainly indicate in the comments field that you need to place a rush on this order. And then the last part of this window is what shows the actual line details that are available to include in the requisition workflow approval in the email. Okay. So we're not going to walk through absolutely all of this. This is some troubleshooting information that you could choose to use if you're working to set up a workflow on your own and you get messages, right? That troubleshooting is going to help you get through the error messages that you might receive. So really important stuff. Keep an idea of bookmark where our InterDyn homepage is so you can get back to this recorded webinar. That'll help you with troubleshooting as necessary. The email approval, you'll need to authenticate to the remote domain after clicking the link. So again, that link that was at the top, it's going to go look for the connection information, it's going to look for web services, and the drill back only opens the inquiry window. Approval is only possible through the link, right? So if I were approving based on an email, then this lower part of my window is where I would be able to, in my approval step, put comments on my approval as well. So you can have communication that goes back and forth, and all of that information is saved right within the workflow. So I'm going to jump back to my GP for just one more minute and show you that in transactions where I have submitted things for workflow, for instance, in my purchase order entry windows, any of those, oops, actually I'll use my requisitions because it looks like that one's turned on. I would be able to view all of the details. They haven't been submitted yet. I guess I won't do that. Anyway, there is a button on the top that next to the Submit button that allows you to look at all of the workflow history for that particular document. So you'd be able to look back at when, I know what I'll do. I'll show it to you this way. There we go. I would be able to see the details of this based on the workflow history. Sorry. I'll just tell you about it. The workflow history information is all saved when it went to someone for approval, what the date and time was that they approved it, and all the comments are all kept in history. Okay, the workflow document attachment. As of 2015 R2, attachments can be sent with the workflow task notifications, so you could be able to see those. I've made note on the slide about the prerequisites, as well as made mention of it when we did our first part of our setup, so you can send those out. And new in 2016 is the Word templates for those batch approvals, so I mentioned it in our demo, where those include Word templates need to be included. And there are some, I mentioned there's a new ability to be able to reassign, send it on to someone else, or delegate to a different approver. So again, those are 2016 features. You wouldn't have those if you were on an earlier version. And the other thing that I want to mention to you is that the list of workflow conditions that we were looking at, there actually is a method that's available to you to be able to expand even beyond what you see in that window when you're trying to do those workflow approvals. So if you need to have it routed based on something like a segment of your chart of accounts, it is possible to do that. It is something that you would likely want to include InterDyn in your planning and setup, because there's some additional steps that would be necessary beyond what we're talking about in our webinar today. So we'd be happy to help you with that. We would certainly be happy to help you with any of the setups within your workflow process setups. And I will turn it back over to Kim now for any of the questions that you might have about our webinar today.
All right. So again, on the right-hand side, you'll see questions as an area on the panel. And if you have any questions, please put those in. And Sandy, I don't see any questions at the moment. I guess I get excited about thinking on automation and workflows and everything else, and you went through this. I understand that you've got clients that have, hired us to help you in setting up these workflows. What do you recommend? Is it something, especially when you begin to really leverage the expertise of someone like yourself as step number one, and then later on do it yourself? What do you think?
Well, I do. I think this is one of the areas where, because it's kind of a combination of Active Directory and some thinking through some methodologies about how to get things routed to the right people, we've had great success at InterDyn with some rather complicated requirements, and even using other ISVs like the plugins that you have from Rockton or other places where you've got those other ISVs included. Then we've even been able to leverage using those other ISVs as methods to be able to do routing, so that we have great expertise, great understanding of how to use the tool in the best possible way to get it out to the right people for your approvals. So once you get those created, it's far easier for you to, as a user, to copy those. You can copy them to other companies. You can copy the details out of one to make another one. So I do think that it's really valuable to have us help design what it is you need to have routed, have us help validate that it actually is a possibility, and then once you get some of that under your belt, that information under your belt, it becomes far less daunting to be able to repeat that or copy those into other workflows or other companies. So, yep, I think there's great opportunity for us to work together on those kinds of things.
I think so too. Kind of like learning how to bake for the first time, right?
Yeah.
Get someone that knows what they're doing first and then go from there. Here's a question. When you turn on the accounts payable batch flow, this made our payment batches difficult as the approver had to be before they could be completed.
That's correct. So any of the batches, when you turn it on for something like a payables, it's going to relate to all the batches that are payables type batches. So the approval process has to take place before they can do any of the transaction activity. That's by design. They have to be able to do that on those batches. If that is a challenge for you, then we could certainly look at maybe doing something more like the payable transaction ones, and that would help alleviate some of that.
Sounds good. When you say that, are you talking about document management solutions?
No, just the alternative is a payable transaction instead of payables batches.
Oh, gotcha. Okay. Well, that's good. Good. All right. Well, thank you, Sandy, as always. It's fun listening to you, and it's great education.